The discipline of a democracy. In both the U.S. and Germany, censorship of the press increased dramatically during the era of the New Deal and Nazism. But more often, the press censored itself to support the state, avoid punishment, or simply to abide by the norms of culture that were increasingly hostile to free expression. In Germany, hundreds of journalists enthusiastically joined the Ministry of Propaganda. For others, mere knowledge of the consequences of non-compliance with the often unwritten rules sufficed to encourage most of them to toe the line and enforce the most effective and invisible form of control: self-censorship. In the U.S., there was some heavy-handed censorship, but far more willing submission by the press itself. Roosevelt appointed loyalists to the Federal Communications Commission, who made it clear that licenses would be revoked for broadcasters who aired programs critical of the government. In 1934, the Yankee Radio Network of New England promised to give the president a lot of support after it received warnings from an FCC commissioner. An executive for another network said that the fear of government intervention would blue pencil a dozen programs for every one that an official censor might object to. In the first weeks of the Roosevelt administration, NBC instituted a policy barring the president's critics from its broadcasts. Henry Bellows of CBS told Roosevelt's press secretary immediately after the inauguration that the close contact between you and the broadcasters has tremendous possibilities of value to the administration, and as a lifelong Democrat, I want to pledge my best efforts in making this cooperation successful. In 1935, CBS celebrated the second anniversary of the New Deal with Of the People, By the People, For the People, a program in which professional actors recreated great moments in the administration's first 2 years. The U.S. Office of Education mandated that civics classes in public schools play the 2-hour program for students. Boke Carter of CBS was the most popular political commentator until 1938, when he was fired for his increasingly critical remarks about the president. Both CBS and NBC continued to ban critics of the New Deal through the 1930s and into the war. Hollywood, the chief transmitter of national social norms, underwent a profound transformation during the New Deal. As we have seen in the 1920s and especially in the early 1930s, rogues were the heroes of the silver screen, as Hollywood movies reflected and promoted the sexual liberation and disregard for authority that were evident in American culture at the time. The Catholic Church and other moral reformers pressured Hollywood to clean up its movies. In 1930, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, better known as the Hays Office after its chairman, Will Hays, issued a code of self-censorship for the industry. But it was not enforced for several years. According to Hays, Hollywood and America were not yet ready to limit their freedom of expression. Trying to preach morality in a cataclysm of that sort was like a voice sounding off in the desert, he said. The so-called Hays Code was not implemented until March 6, 1933, 2 days after Roosevelt took office. This indicated, according to film historian Giuliano Muschio, author of the only scholarly study of the subject, that the industry was afraid that an administration that championed federal intervention like the New Deal would interfere with film affairs. That is, the studio chiefs understood that if they didn't censor themselves, Washington would do it for them. The Hays Code was as thoroughgoing a restriction of expression as any system of censorship imposed in Germany and Italy. It also far outlived the Nazi and fascist regimes. For more than 32 years until it was replaced in 1967 by the film rating system, virtually all motion pictures produced in the United States adhered to the code. To begin, the code stated broadly, no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Only correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. The third section of the code, which mandated that law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, was undoubtedly well received by a federal government that was then producing a massive and unprecedented system of regulatory laws. The depiction of sexuality was severely restricted. The sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home shall be upheld, the code stated. Pictures shall not infer that low forms of sex relationship are the accepted or common thing. More to the point, scenes of passion should not be introduced when not essential to the plot. What were the forbidden low forms of sexuality? Excessive and lustful kissing, lustful embraces, suggestive postures and gestures are not to be shown. In general, passion should so be treated that these scenes do not stimulate the lower and baser element. Of course, sex perversion, referring to homosexuality, or any inference to it is forbidden. But so was white slavery, miscegenation, sex relationships between the white and black races, mention of sex hygiene and venereal disease, and even indecent movements in dancing. To keep audiences from drawing illicit connections, the treatment of bedrooms must be governed by good taste and delicacy. The scenes of actual childbirth, in fact or in silhouette, are never to be presented. In language virtually identical to the Third Reich's laws against degenerative art, the code proclaimed that it was intended to produce correct entertainment and prevent the creation of wrong entertainment that lowers the whole living conditions and moral ideals of a race. While the Nazis were purging German museums of thousands of works of immoral art, the most popular art form in the United States was being produced according to a set of rules organized around the belief that art can be morally evil in its effects. This was the case clearly enough with unclean art, indecent books, suggestive drama. It is well known that the state and the media were merged in Italy and Germany. In the United States, the merger of the New Deal and Hollywood was less formal, but no less complete. It began even before Roosevelt was elected. In September 1932, Jack Warner of Warner Brothers staged the motion picture electrical parade and sports pageant at Los Angeles Olympic Stadium, which according to Muschio was a spectacle in the style of a gigantic Busby Berkeley film and an unequivocal political promotion of Roosevelt as a presidential candidate. It featured giant electrical floats and human geometrics of bodies reminiscent of the mass choreography typical of Nazism. Warner Brothers continued to be an unofficial propagandist for the New Deal after the election. In 1933, the studio released The Road is Open Again, which served precisely the function performed by the Nazi propaganda offices. In this film, the spirits of Presidents Washington, Lincoln, and Wilson praise the current president. Washington: "Well, Abe, it looks as though we can stop worrying about our country. Roosevelt has it headed right again." Lincoln: "All it needed was a plan of action and a man with the courage to carry it through." Wilson: "There isn't a person in America who won't benefit by the NRA if every man, woman, and child does his part." Washington: "You can always depend on Americans." Another Warner Brothers film released in 1933, a box office smash called Footlight Parade, features a grand finale choreographed by Busby Berkeley, in which marching soldiers form themselves into images of an American flag, a portrait of FDR, and the NRA eagle. Other studios did their share for the New Deal as well. Fox's biggest star in the early 1930s was Will Rogers, who was also the leading supporter of the New Deal in American popular culture. Rogers had been a vaudeville and silent movie star in the 1910s and 1920s, but he gained his greatest fame during the first 3 years of the Roosevelt administration. He starred in 12 films between 1933 and 1935, and during that time established what came to be known as the Will Rogers formula. Typically, Rogers played a plain, pure-of-heart character from a rural town who is victimized by big city businessmen. The plot normally involved the collective work of ordinary Americans like himself to overcome their oppression. In nearly all of his films, work, in particular direct physical labor carried out cooperatively and for the community rather than for individual gain, is portrayed as noble, while the desire for material comforts and luxuries is shown as the source of corruption. Rogers campaigned vigorously for Roosevelt in the 1932 election, then used his radio show to promote New Deal policies. He called himself the #1 New Dealer. Rogers was also a great admirer of another world leader. "Mussolini, he's the biggest thing in the world today," he said on a speaking tour in 1927, 1 year after he met Il Duce in Italy. "Anyone who can put those Dagos to work is some guy." Later, in a speech to a crowd of his fans, the #1 New Dealer praised Mussolini's militarism. "He knows the nations that are great are the ones that have something in the way of sidearms. He knows that without an army and navy, they will never be able to find room for his growing population. That fellow has kept Italy on the upgrade for all these years, and all the time everybody says, 'Oh, he can't last.' I have said ever since I met him in 26 that he was by far the greatest guy I had ever met, and there has never been a day since then that I have changed. He has done more for his country than any man ever did for one in a lifetime. You don't see 'em shooting at him anymore, do you? He is a whiz, that baby is. I have never yet seen him propose a fool thing." After he died in a plane crash, Rogers was replaced at the top of the box office charts by Shirley Temple, whose breakthrough film was Stand Up and Cheer, released by Fox in 1934. In the film, the President of the United States, who looks very much like Franklin Roosevelt, appoints a Secretary of Amusement to cheer up the country. The Secretary recruits vaudeville acts, in opposition to a gloomy group of businessmen called the Blue Noses, who have a financial interest in prolonging the Depression. His star performer is a 4-year-old girl, played by Temple, who wins over the nation with her singing. At the end of the film, a crowd shouts into the camera, "The Depression is over! Men are going back to work!" Another staple of post-code New Deal Hollywood was a series of films made by Frank Capra for Columbia Pictures in the late 1930s and early 1940s, most famously Mr. Deeds Goes to Town in 1936 and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in 1939. The typical Capra film featured a hero much like Will Rogers, whose close-knit and cooperative small town is threatened either by greedy capitalists or by corrupt politicians. As the University of Maryland historian Gary Gerstle has put it, Capra's films both drew on and contributed to the reform civic nationalism that was so crucial to the success of Roosevelt and his New Deal. New Deal films presented an American version of the folk ethos that was developed in Germany in the 19th century. According to many German philosophers, authors, artists, and folklorists, the spirit of a nation was determined by those who were organically connected to its soil and traditions. This usually meant those who literally worked the land, who sacrificed themselves for the community and eschewed luxury, and whose ancestry could be traced to the nation's founding. In 20th century Germany, this concept produced hostility to ethnic groups who were not the Nordic or Aryan people of Northern Europe, city dwellers, merchants, and others who did not work with their hands, and democratic institutions that treated the folk and other inferior races as equals. The Nazi built their ideology around this concept. "Life is an act of sacrifice for the sake of our neighbor," wrote Joseph Goebbels of the folk. "And my neighbor is he who has the same blood." The Nazi government, according to Heinrich Himmler, depended on the belief in the value and holiness of the soil. Gregor Strasser, the first Reich propaganda chief, condemned the desire for material wealth. "The spirit to be overcome is the spirit of materialism," he wrote in one of the party's founding documents. "We must learn that work means more than possessions. The simplicity and toil of the peasants who worked the land gave Germany its soul, in which lies the drive to work and the possibilities work brings, as well as the eternal longing for redemption from the intellect," said Goebbels. Nazis argued that the Volk, not a democracy of equals, should determine the nation's destiny, and it should do so by speaking through a single leader who understood the will of the people. Capra's most important films contain all the elements of the Volk concept. Longfellow Deeds of Mr. Deeds, played by the impeccably Anglo-Saxon Gary Cooper, is a plain and honest Yankee who lives in the rural hamlet of Mandrake Falls, Vermont, until he inherits an enormous fortune. He is taken to New York City by a cynical big-city lawyer who spends the movie scheming to get his money. Deeds decides to give away his inheritance to dispossessed farmers, provided they stay on their land and work it. The hero of Mr. Smith is essentially the same character, this time played by Jimmy Stewart, the son of rural Pennsylvania Presbyterians. When a U.S. senator suddenly dies, the corrupt political boss of his Farm Belt state picks Jefferson Smith, native everyman, the naive and simple leader of the local boy rangers, to fill the term, mostly because he believes that Smith will do his bidding. When he arrives in Washington, Smith is mocked by the political and media elites as a bumpkin. He drafts a bill that would provide territory for a national boys' camp, but is blocked by the political machine's greedy land grab. His decent, salt-of-the-earth constituents rally around him, and after a pilgrimage to the Lincoln Memorial, Smith launches a one-man filibuster that ultimately saves the day. In Mr. Smith and Mr. Deeds, as in all of Capra's major productions, the hero single-handedly delivers retribution for the plain folk. More than one critic has noticed a similarity to tales that were being told in Germany. The Roosevelt administration appreciated the efforts of the Hays Office, which was busily purifying Hollywood films according to the Motion Picture Production Code. In 1938, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in Photoplay magazine that she was happy to see that movie producers had taken on the responsibility of creating good taste in the American public. And without the slightest embarrassment, she declared that censorship and the narrowing of artistic expression around good taste served the national interest. The highly cultured people of the world are those who have good taste. Some things in literature and the arts have always presaged decadence. These things must be kept from the drama if we are to promote good taste. Here is the great challenge to the movie producer of the future. Will movies be an instrument in the development of good taste? And are we growing up to be a nation with artistic knowledge and appreciation? In 1941, Will Hays received a letter of encouragement from Franklin Roosevelt, in which the president praised him as the engineer of the greatest propaganda machine in the country. Urging the Hollywood censor to continue his work, Roosevelt wrote, "You are the kind of czar that nobody could call a dictator because you are fair-minded and do not use a whip but still get things done for the general good." Indeed, the leaders of the American movie industry enjoyed extraordinarily close relationships with both Roosevelt and Mussolini. In 1935, Charles Pettijohn, General Counsel for the Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors of America, met with Mussolini and suggested making a documentary about the fascist state. He guaranteed that it would be shown in about 14,500 American theaters, so that about 70 million Americans would have understood better Italy's position. In 1936, Hays himself traveled to Italy when some fascist officials suggested blocking the importation of American movies. Hays convinced Mussolini that the Code's reformation of American movies had aligned them with the moral values of the Italian state. After that meeting, Mussolini allowed more than 250 American films to be shown in Italy per year. Hays then appointed Pettijohn to serve as an unofficial liaison between the U.S. and Italian governments. In 1937, Pettijohn met with Vittorio Mussolini, Il Duce's son, who was on his way to Hollywood to establish a production company with studio chief Hal Roach, who had made stars out of Laurel and Hardy, the Our Gang Kids, and Will Rogers. The company was called Ram Films for Roach and Mussolini, and it made documentary newsreels promoting Italy. Pettyjohn wrote the Roosevelt's son-in-law, John Bettiger, that the young Mussolini was a fine, quiet, modest young man who expressed a very sincere desire to meet the president before he goes back to Italy. Pettyjohn's letter revealed friendly relations between the Roosevelt and Mussolini families. The president's son, John Roosevelt, met his father, Benito Mussolini, in Rome, and I just suspect that the president would permit this boy, Vittorio, to return the call. Shortly thereafter, Vittorio Mussolini had tea with FDR in the White House. Regimentation, the hallmark of Nazi and fascist culture, was a prominent theme in Hollywood musicals and federal propaganda during the New Deal. Busby Berkeley and Warner Brothers put out several enormously popular films in the early years of the New Deal that were openly partisan for the Roosevelt administration. Gold Diggers of 1933, 42nd Street, Footlight Parade, and Dames all featured tightly synchronized movements by large numbers of dancers and implicit collectivist messages. Berkeley acknowledged that designing parade drills as an Army lieutenant during World War I was the best apprenticeship for his career as a choreographer. Martial imagery was a staple of the New Deal culture, and it was common for public officials to speak of bringing order and discipline to daily life. In 1932, Roosevelt pledged during his election campaign to mobilize the infantry of our economic army. A few months into his presidency, the National Recovery Administration distributed badges to be worn by participants in what Roosevelt called the Great Offensive against unemployment. In war, in the gloom of night attack, soldiers wear a bright badge on their shoulders to be sure that comrades do not fire on comrades. On that principle, those who cooperate in this program must know each other at a glance. That is why we have provided a badge of honor for this purpose, a simple design with a legend, "We do our part," and I ask that all those who join with me shall display that badge prominently. It is essential to our purpose. In 1937, Roosevelt used similar language to ask Congress for new public works programs. "You and I cannot afford to equip ourselves with 2 rounds of ammunition where 3 rounds are necessary," he said. "If we stop at relief and credit, we may find ourselves without ammunition before the enemy is routed. If we are fully equipped with the 3rd round of ammunition, we stand to win the battle against adversity." In that same speech, he issued a warning about the freedom of speech. "There is placed on all of us the duty of self-restraint," he said. "That is the discipline of a democracy. Every patriotic citizen must say to himself or herself that immoderate statement, appeals to prejudice, the creation of unkindness, are offenses not against an individual or individuals, but offenses against the whole population of the United States." Roosevelt's cabinet members often spoke of him as though he were the leader of a conquering army. Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, said in 1934 that FDR grasped this acute situation with a firm hand and proceeded to restore order. In my judgment, here is the leader you have been looking for more years than you would like to remember. And miracle of miracles, this leader in a great forward movement for a new and better social order is actually occupying the seat of the mightiest ruler in the world today. Strong in the faith of the people, entrenched in their confident affections, he will not fail us unless we fail him. He is the master of a stout ship, sailing in the right direction. Granted any sort of favoring breeze, he will bring us safely into the harbor of a fairer land. Other New Dealers called for regimentation in daily life. Russell M. Wilder, the chairman of the Committee on Food and Nutrition of the National Research Council, called for the mustering of a nutrition army. Fortunately, he said, an army of women trained in schools of home economics is already in the field. They have been there for several years, holding the front, so to speak, with almost no support and very little appreciation from the rest of us. Similarly, the WPA often equated social order with health. Washington, D.C. and many German cities were remade during the period of the New Deal and Nazism. Hitler's architects designed several buildings that became characteristic of a distinctive Nazi architecture, including the Olympic Stadium, the new Reich Chancellery, the Tempelhof Airport, the Ministry of Aviation, the Japanese Embassy in Berlin, and the House of German Art. Hitler also worked with his favorite architect, Albert Speer, on a complete redesign of Berlin that included an immense domed Great Hall connected by a 3-mile-long avenue to the Chancellery. While planning these buildings, Nazi architects implemented the theory of ruin value, which was enthusiastically supported by Hitler. According to this theory, all new buildings were designed to leave imposing ruins thousands of years in the future that would stand as testaments to the greatness of the Third Reich. This theory was realized in monumental stone constructions that imitated ancient Greek and Roman styles. The monumentalist, neoclassical style was also favored by architects hired by the Roosevelt administration to design the buildings that came to define modern Washington, including the Federal Triangle, the National Gallery of Art, the National Archives, the Supreme Court Building, the Pentagon, the Department of Justice Building, and the Jefferson Memorial. The architectural historian Thomas S. Hines has noticed that this was a transatlantic phenomenon. Roosevelt's architectural tastes were grandly conservative, not far removed from those of his contemporaries, the dictators of Italy and Germany. Hines wrote, "Particularly striking were the similarities between the designs of Albert Speer and Roosevelt's favorite architect, James Russell Pope." Hines suggested that historians begin to make overt comparisons, formally and culturally, of the architecture of Pope and the frequently similar work of the German architect Albert Speer. Another architectural historian, John W. Reps, has noted the supreme irony that an architectural style originally conceived to magnify the glories of despotic kings and emperors came to be applied as a national symbol of a country whose philosophical basis was so firmly rooted in democratic equality. Certainly, there was one obvious difference between the New Deal and Nazism, which is that in the United States there was never a mass murder of Jews, or of gypsies, the disabled, communists, or homosexuals, in the name of racial purity. There was, however, a different form of racial purification attempted in the U.S., one that was carried out by Jews against themselves. Before the New Deal, Jewish heroes filled the eyes of moviegoers. Jewish and Gentile filmmakers told stories set in Eastern European shtetls and the Lower East Side. American audiences saw rabbis, cantors, street peddlers, and Yiddish-speaking heroes. Unambiguously Jewish movie stars such as Vera Gordon, Molly Picon, Eddie Cantor, Fanny Brice, Al Jolson, and the Marx Brothers played unambiguously Jewish characters named Cohen, Goldberg, Rubens, Feinbaum, and Rabinowitz. Even the famous WASP and racist director D.W. Griffith made a sentimental film about a young seamstress in the Lower East Side who struggles with the death of her mother. Remarkably, the heyday of Jews in films took place during the 1920s, which was also the heyday of American anti-Semitism, when more than 4 million people joined the Ku Klux Klan, books and newspapers warning of the international Jew sold by the millions, and immigration was cut off from Eastern Europe. One group of Jewish filmmakers in Philadelphia responded by deliberately producing even more films on the everyday life of the Jew. More remarkably, in the midst of a viciously anti-Semitic culture in the late 1920s and early 1930s, when Jews were widely blamed for the Depression, some of the most successful Hollywood films celebrated Jewish-Gentile intermarriage. Following the premise of the enormously successful Abby's Irish Rose, 1928, The Coens and Kellys series, a string of 7 comedies made by Universal Pictures during the period, told the story of a marriage between a Jewish woman and an Irish Catholic man. By the time of the New Deal, Jews had taken over much of the American film industry. 7 of the 8 major Hollywood studios during the 1930s were owned wholly by immigrant Jews, and the chairman and co-owner of the 8th, 20th Century Fox, was Joseph Schenck, who was born in a Russian shtetl. A 1936 study found that 62% of studio employees engaged in production were Jewish, but these Jews had a different mission than their predecessors. They played golf and polo. They married Gentile women. Louis Mayer, the head of MGM, claimed that he had lost his birth records while immigrating from Russia and took July 4th as his birthday. Harry Cohn of Columbia Pictures delighted in telling Jew jokes, and when asked to contribute to a Jewish relief fund, yelled, "Relief for Jews! How about relief from Jews?" All the Hollywood moguls threw lavish Christmas parties, rarely if ever attended synagogue, and made a point of working on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Passover. They mocked kosher dietary rules. Film historian Neil Gabler, author of An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood, has described the anti-Semitism of Hollywood Jews in the 1930s in terms of a cultural holocaust. Above all things, they wanted to be regarded as Americans, not Jews. They wanted to reinvent themselves here as new men. Assimilation among immigrants was nothing new, but something drove the young Hollywood Jews to a ferocious, even pathological embrace of America. Something drove them to deny whatever they had been before settling here. The men who controlled Hollywood embarked on an assimilation so ruthless and complete that they cut their lives to the pattern of American respectability as they interpreted it. They launched a war against their own pasts. Hollywood films of the New Deal era were an exercise in what historian Gary Gerstle calls ethnic erasure. Jews were removed from American culture. The dominant tendency of the 30s is the repression of ethnic and cultural differences and the representation of the average American, the final result of the great melting pot, writes film historian Patricia Ahrens, author of The Jew in American Cinema. By average, Hollywood meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Thus, for most of the 30s, the Jew, as a recognizable character, practically disappears from the screen. The Hays Office disallowed the use of the words Jew or Jewish and any reference to religious practices. In films set in Europe, Jews were designated as non-Aryan, a Nazi term. Studio executives insisted that Jewish actors Americanize their names. Emanuel Goldenberg became Edward G. Robinson. Betty Persky became Lauren Bacall. David Kaminsky became Danny Kaye. Bernard Schwartz became Tony Curtis. And Isur Danielevich Dembski became the square-jawed, all-American Kirk Douglas. Stories taken from the Yiddish theater were translated into films with Gentile characters and settings far from the ghetto. Even movies about famous episodes of anti-Semitism like They Won't Forget, 1937, about the Leo Frank case, and The Life of Emile Zola, 1937, about the Dreyfus Affair, made the victims into Gentiles. Racial purity was a prominent theme in New Deal culture. Eugenics, a doctrine organized around the belief that the human race can and should be perfected by encoding breeding among superior people and preventing breeding among the inferior, is commonly associated with the Nazi regime. However, Nazis learned much of what they knew about eugenics from Americans. And while the Roosevelt administration never officially promoted eugenics, as the Nazis did, its forerunners introduced the doctrine, and the New Deal was born during the heyday of American eugenics. By the mid-1930s, 41 states prohibited marriage among the feeble-minded and insane, and 30 allowed eugenic sterilization. In Alabama, those considered by the state to be feeble-minded were involuntarily sterilized. In California, the law also allowed for habitual criminals, idiots, and mental defectives to be forced to have the surgery. Connecticut committed those with inherited tendency to crime to be sterilized. Laws in 14 states applied to epileptics. Moral degenerates and sexual perverts were sterilized in North Dakota, Oregon, and Washington. Morally degenerate persons in Idaho and Iowa. In Wisconsin, the law applied to criminal persons. According to historian Stephen Selden, author of Inheriting Shame, The Story of Eugenics and Racism in America, eugenic ideology was deeply embedded in American popular culture during the 1920s and 1930s. Films such as The Black Stork promoted the sterilization of unfit women. Many ministers taught their congregations that genetically superior people should be careful to avoid marrying someone from an inferior gene pool. State fairs across the country featured Fitter Families exhibits that offered free eugenic evaluations. Those who received low scores were warned that they might be among those Americans who were born to be a burden on the rest. High scorers were given medals proclaiming, "Yay, I have a goodly heritage." In the 1930s, most high school science textbooks included lessons in eugenics, including the concept of fit and unfit races, and the need to sterilize the unfit to preserve American culture. Harvard, Columbia, Cornell, and Brown were among hundreds of colleges and universities that offered courses on eugenics. American eugenics and the New Deal were both progeny of the progressives. A large number of progressives who established many of the principles and policies that were later developed by the Roosevelt administration, including Margaret Sanger, David Starr Jordan, Robert Latham Owen, William Allen Wilson, Harry Emerson Fosdick, Robert Latu Dickinson, Catherine Bement Davis, Virginia Gildersleeve, and Rexford Tugwell's mentors, Simon Patton and Scott Nearing, were deeply involved with the eugenics movement. They saw in it a means to extend their mission of social planning into the bedroom and the maternity ward, to regulate the population at its genesis. Paul Popenoe, the most influential American eugenicist, was a leader in the progressive movement for social hygiene. During World War I, Popenoe was a captain in the U.S. Army Sanitary Corps, in charge of controlling liquor and vice in army camps, a major progressive cause. After the war, Popenoe's research and advocacy helped make California the leader in eugenic sterilizations. His book, Sterilization for Human Betterment, was one of the first American books translated into German by the Nazi government, and it was widely cited by Hitler's racial hygiene theorists to justify the Nazis' own sterilization programs. In 1934, Popenoe praised Hitler for establishing his hopes of biological regeneration solidly on the application of biological principles of human society. Other American eugenicists expressed envy for their more successful German colleagues, as did Dr. Joseph S. DeJarnette, director of Western State Hospital in Virginia, in 1938. Germany, in 6 years, has sterilized about 80,000 of her unfit, while the United States, with approximately twice the population, has only sterilized about 27,869 to January 1, 1938, in the past 20 years. The fact that there are 12 million defectives in the U.S. should arouse our best efforts to push this procedure to the maximum. However, DeJarnette could take some solace in the fact that more sterilizations took place during the New Deal than at any other time in American history. The leading historian of the American eugenics movement, Daniel Kevles, found that through the 1920s, the national sterilization rate had annually run between 2 and 4 per 100,000 in the American population. In the mid-30s, the rate shot up to 15 and climbed to 20 by the end of the decade. Moreover, from 1932 to 1941, sterilization was actually practiced, as distinct from merely legislated, in a greater number of states than before. In 1940, the Pioneer Fund, a leading eugenicist organization, embarked on an experiment with the help of Roosevelt's Secretary of War, Harry H. Woodring, to find a way to improve the human race. The group offered $4,000, the equivalent of a middle-class salary, for the education of additional children born to U.S. Air Corps officers who already had at least 3 offspring, a group they considered to be genetically superior. The Air Corps, the precursor to the Air Force, promoted the program among its officers and provided the Pioneer Fund with extensive personnel records, including information on parentage, race, and religion. 12 children received scholarships from the fund before the war ended the experiment. The Second World War appeared to many contemporary observers, and still appears to many historians, as proof of a fundamental antagonism between fascism and the American way of life. Many have seen the war as evidence that, in particular, the New Deal liberal way of life was hostile to fascism. After all, while many Republicans and other enemies of the New Deal were opposed to fighting fascism abroad, Roosevelt led the nation to war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. More than 400,000 Americans died in the fight, and the Roosevelt administration made sure to not just defeat the fascist regimes, but to obliterate them. But the evidence of their similarities suggests that the New Deal and fascism went to war not over ideas or values or a way of life. Rather, it seems, the war was a struggle between brothers for control of the world family.